Kirsten. I work with CTO here at MCW. Today we are going to be talking about source documents and case report forms. Obviously, we all use these quite frequently. They're a very important part of research. This is all revolving around the data collection. So where does it come from? How do we collect it? How do we make sure that this data that we're collecting is accurate? So we're going to start with talking about the whole purpose of a source document. We need source documents to show that the research actually happened. Anyone should be able to look at our source documents at any time from anywhere and see what happened and where all that information came from. I think that we should probably have CTO t-shirts at this point that just say if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So I'm pretty sure we talk about that at every single one of our trainings, but source documents are obviously the center of that. So what qualifies as a source document? Anything that provides the data that's going to be used or analyzed within the context of the research protocol is a source document. So if this information is being provided orally from a patient, the first place you write that information down is now a source document. That means a piece of scrap paper that you jotted down a set of vitals on. It means a page in your notebook where you wrote down an AE that a patient called you about. It's all source if it's the first place that you collected the information. So here's some more examples. It seems pretty extensive, this list here, but these are all documents that we work with every day within our roles as research staff. Sometimes we're pulling these from medical records. Sometimes they're collected specifically for a research-related visit on those source documents that we create. Either way, they are considered source and they have to be maintained as such. Electronic source documentation. This is going to be any combination of text, graphics, data, etc. That we're using within a computer system. So all electronic source documentation has to be 21 CFR Part 11 compliant in order to be used legally for research. So these are those guidelines that are set forth in order to ensure that that data collection can be trusted as much as paper records and ink signatures. And so in order to do that, the computer systems we're using have to be validated. There has to be an audit system for any electronic signatures that are captured. And then there has to be user and technical support. This doesn't apply to paper records that are transmitted electronically. So if you're sending those information over email, things like that, that doesn't fall into that Part 11 compliance. We're talking about actual source documentation. So if it's the first place that you're collecting that information. Paper source, obviously this is usually the bane of a CRC's existence. Paper source tends to be more commonly used in later phase research, whereas earlier phase, such as phase 1, things like that, we kind of use almost all e-source. But so where do these documents come from? If you're lucky, they will come from the sponsor and they will include every little thing that they want you to collect. But most of the time we are not that lucky. A lot of the time we create them ourselves here as the study team. We do that using the protocol, mostly our schedule of events. When you're creating your own source documents, you usually find a template that works best for you, like within your department. That flow that you put the events in order of, things like that. You can use that and reapply that same template to multiple studies, just changing out the content of the events that you need. And when creating these, you just rely very heavily on your protocol. Not only that schedule of events, but all of those little individual portions that explain each event. Referencing all of that when creating your source documentation is going to make sure that you've captured everything that you really need to capture on these. And then the best thing you can always do is ask your sponsor, ask your monitor, anybody you have available to review them, to just look them over and see if they notice anything that you're missing. Obviously, they should be very well versed in the protocol and they can pick up on little things. So always make sure that you ask to have them reviewed. But also remember, it's a living document, just like your informed consent form. So if you use it for the first time and you realize something's missing, the flow isn't right, you can revamp your source documentation before your next study visit to make sure that you don't have that same problem again. So once again, living document, we can edit it as needed. So key elements in source documentation. The things that you really need to make sure that you're collecting, things like consent, your eligibility, all your procedures and your study drug, your intervention, any adverse events, your drug accountability, all of this kind of stuff is the main points that you're going to be wanting to collect on source documentation. The best thing you can do is leave sections for notes so that you can record any miscellaneous findings. Make sure to give yourself room to document AEs using the subject's words. So give yourself those open text box so that when a patient is describing their adverse events to you, you can record what they're saying almost verbatim, write down word for word what they're saying. There should be a section to record absolutely everything that the protocol says should occur on that day. And once again, it's very important to make sure that these reflect the protocol accurately. For example, my first job as a CRC, I was like the greenest of green CRCs a little over a decade ago. And my second week on the job, the FDA walked in to audit a study that I had not worked on at all. I was brand new to being a CRC and had no idea what a lot of the things were he was talking about. And he found that the coordinator before me on the source documents had created for their AEs, he was reporting them as either minor, intermediate, or severe. This is because he had created a source document template for a previous study that worked great for that study. And so he had copied and pasted a lot of his boxes into his new source documents and was just using them and having a great time. Well, if you look at the protocol, they had graded reporting. So it was grade 1, 2, 3, 4 for AEs. So basically, they'd gone through the entire study. They had over 20 patients. It was a 2-year-long study. The PI had signed off on these source documents. The monitor had monitored these source documents and no one caught it, that he was collecting things wrong on the source documentation. And because our source is our way and our truth, there's no way to really go back and just fix that. It was just all inaccurately collected information, which was obviously a major finding. And me being 2 weeks into my CRC job, I was like, cool, don't even know how to handle this. But so that's what I'm saying, when it's really important to compare each of those little sections, even if you're using them from previous source documents, to compare them to your protocol. Just make sure that they are matching up appropriately. So ICF documentation, this is a big part of creating our source documents, is documenting that we are consenting patients. When entering a patient into a study, informed consent is always the first thing we perform. We know that. And therefore, it should be the first thing that we document as well. It should be listed at the top of a source document. You can put in a statement that this was performed first and foremost. You can put that right into your source document, or you can record the time that the consent took place in order to show that that was done first. We can look at examples here of how to document that. So in this example, you can see we're documenting whether or not consent was obtained, when it was, what time, who recorded the consent, obtained the consent, and then whether or not a copy was given to the subject or to the parent as well. This is pediatric research. And then obviously this would be filed along with your original version of the consent form to show that you did proper consenting. Inclusion, exclusion, so eligibility is another important piece that we have to document within our source documents. You should always be really thorough with this piece. The most accurate way to record that this was met is to list them out individually within your source document as a checklist. So that's taking them directly out of the protocol, item by item. And as you're going through screening this patient, you're looking at each one with your PI and we're going, check, yep, they met that, they don't meet these for exclusion. And then at the end, there should be a signature line where the PI is signing off that he did review that day of screening. Even if he sent you an email like 2 weeks before, like, oh yeah, this patient's eligible, it's all good to go, let's screen them. You still need to document that they were eligible that day, the day that they were actually enrolled in the study, because a lot can change in that time, even a couple days, a lot can change. So just making sure that you have a place on your source documentation to remind yourself to sit down, review these piece by piece, and have the PI sign off on them, giving you the green light, confirmed in writing that this patient was in fact eligible for the trial this day. So like I said, you can definitely tailor your source documents to fit the needs of your study team. However, there's certain items and elements that are must-haves. Subject identifiers are one of these. You have to be able to show that this patient which patient the specific source document is for. So when an auditor comes in and monitor, anybody has to be able to match that document against an enrollment list. So say you forgot to clip it in your binder and it fell out of your patient binder, you should be able to pick that up off the floor and see exactly which patient it's for, which study visit, all that kind of stuff. So documentation for the study visit, which day that occurred on. And then you should also have documentation to show the patient's state prior to study participation. This can be done through having those text box that we had talked about available, their medical history, their AE review, all of that should be documented right within your source documents. There should always be a spot to record medication accountability. Adverse events are another one that you definitely want thoroughly documented. This includes symptoms, your date of onset, severity, any of the details that the patient is providing orally. This is where, once again, those lovely text boxes come in handy because it gives us the option to write things down verbatim as the patient is reporting. For any exams like physical exams or mental health questionnaires, there should be a results section. If there are specific result parameters, these should be listed identical to how they're listed in the protocol. So for your physical exam, sometimes the protocol will specify specific body systems that they have listed that they want the PI to focus on. Well, then in your source document, you should have sections within your physical exam that record those specific body systems to remind yourself as well as the PI that that's the focus of the physical exam. And once again, you can put little text boxes in there too to allow the PI to document anything that they find relevant that would need specific reporting. So our job as research staff is to maintain adequate and accurate records. So that includes recording observations and all pertinent study related data. At a minimum, we capture demographics, inclusion, exclusion, all the information to support data, exposure to study drug. The best thing you can do is follow the Alcoa Plus standard. I'm sure you've all heard of this as we use it frequently in research. So it has to be attributable, meaning you have to be able to identify and record exactly where this information came from. It's legible. The information needs to be without error and easily readable. It should be contemporaneous. So when collecting data, we have to make sure to record the precise time of collection. Additionally, the record should also show any time of subsequent data modifications. So if at any point you're modifying your data, that should be documented as well. It should be original. So all data should be original data, not copies or modified versions. Should be accurate, meaning you're following good documentation practices and inputting correct and unedited data. It should be complete. So you should keep all generated data. So even if the original data points aren't in use, there should be a complete audit trail that features the data modifications and any time any such edits were made. And then it needs to be consistent. Data should be the same when accessed from anywhere within your system. So if we're looking at your source documents, if you're looking at your data entry, it all needs to be consistent no matter where we're looking at it. It should be enduring, meaning records and information should be stored long after data collection, and it should be available, meaning that even if we're storing it, it's important to be able to retrieve long stored data whenever needed. Therefore, good documentation practices should involve making data available whenever authorized entities require access. This is the whole Alcoa Plus principles. That's where a lot of the parameters for that Part 11 compliance that we had talked about earlier with the electronic data recording, that's kind of where these the Part 11 guidelines come from, is this Alcoa principle. So if you have to make changes or corrections to your source documentation, we just talked about the information needing to be original and accurate. Well, that includes any mistake we made during data collection. The first one is pretty common. I'm sure if you guys are active in research right now, you've had to make corrections before. Once again, we just make that single line through the original entry. We initial and date the correction with the current date, the date that we're making the actual correction on. You keep the original information clearly visible. So when the auditor is going back and looking at this and seeing what you're corrected, they have to be able to see what was put in incorrectly, as well as what you're correcting it for. So you're not scribbling it over. We never use whiteout or write over the top or destroy the originals and recreate. We don't do any of that. And then if you're missing data, so What if you notice that the patient actually had a lab done during their inpatient stay that you didn't originally collect the information on? You know, you accidentally overlooked it in the medical record. It is okay to incorporate it now. However, the best thing we can do is document that it happened and document that we corrected it with the date in which you're correcting it. Obviously, mistakes happen, and I know it's always scary when you realize you made one, but we're human and we're prone to error. And the best thing we can do is just document that error happened, but also document that we corrected it and how, and give it that clear, concise audit trail to show exactly what happened and when. So for procedure and test results, all labs, tests, and imaging results are to be printed and viewed by the PI, signed and dated as required by the sponsor. So all abnormal results are to be determined by the PI to be either clinically significant or not clinically significant. That assessment has to be on that procedure or test results. He can't just sign it. He's got to determine the clinical significance as well. And then it's always important to know if it is clinically significant, is that going to be an adverse event? For Florence, we have, if your source documents should be uploaded, certified and stored in your e-binder. And for the subject binders, there's instructions below on how to do that. Any questions so far on source documentation before we hop into case report forms? Yes. Yep. PIs tend to be, even the whole legible portion of ALCOA, that tends to be where more of that difficulty comes in. Yes, because obviously clinically they don't necessarily use good documentation practices the way we do in research. And so sometimes, yes, that natural instinct is to just, oh, I made a 9, I'll just add a 0 at the bottom, but that does need to be corrected and shown through proper documentation what happened. Yes. Okay. Perfect. All right, then we can hop into case report forms. So what is a case report form? It's a printed optical or electronic document or database designed to record all of the protocol required information. It's usually provided by the sponsor in either paper, which is not as common, or electronic system. It has to be checked against the source document by the sponsor's monitor. So when your monitor comes in and they're looking at your source documents, they're also looking at your CRFs to see if they match. So the purpose of case report forms is to capture all that protocol required information. It helps facilitate data collection and entry. It benefits data management, statistical analysis on the back end to make sure that both match well. And then it promotes data sharing between the study team and other institutions. Your CRF medium varies based on your study. So this is using things like metadata rave, things like that. Those are all CRFs or eCRFs. So yeah, these are meant to capture everything that the sponsor needs to monitor the safety and efficacy, as well as meet their endpoints for the study. They give the study team clear, hopefully, instructions on what needs to be collected. And then they should be, in an absolutely perfect world, user-friendly and uncluttered, and clear instructions for completion. Obviously, that's not always the case, but that is the underlying goal of case report forms. So there are times when your CRFs may serve as source documents. So therefore, your CRF now has two functions. They're part of the medical record, as they would be the first point that we're entering some of this information. And then they're also a data collection tool. So when CRFs or portions of them serve as source documents, the protocol should define which data can be treated that way. And then the sections of the CRF also functioning as source documents should be signed and dated by the person collecting that information. Once again, documenting what happened, where it happened, and who did it. Any regulatory agency can request more information for evidence of testing or diagnosis. So once again, it's just best to document absolutely everything. So now here's just some examples. If you're with a subject for a research visit, You forgot your paperwork, and the only item in the room you can use to document the subject's vitals is a napkin. What do you do? Yep. Yeah, that's correct. You save the napkin. It is now source. I know it sounds silly and it seems ridiculous, but it's source. So now it has to go, the original napkin has to go in your files. So the second one, you're with a subject for a research visit. You forgot your paperwork and there's nothing in the room you can use to document a subject's vitals. What do you do?
You're gonna have your hand in
Yep, or a photocopy. No, you have to cut off your hand and you put it in the binder now. It's source now. No, in this situation, obviously, yes. I mean, if possible, please go get something else because this complicates things so much. If possible, please go get something else. But yes, yes.
Yeah.
They're writing it on their glove quickly. Yes.
Right.
Honestly, yeah, the best thing, if that does have to happen, if you have to write it on your hand, you photocopy it, you label it as a copy, and even though clearly it's a copy of a hand, but you still have to label it as a copy, and then you're signing and dating to show. So number 3, the subject brought back her drug dosing diary, but she spilled coffee on it and would like a new diary to fill out. What would you do in that situation?
The original one. And then make a note to file. And probably, I don't know if you can write in that diary itself, but note to file that. Well, the diary would be for. Right, from that point forward, right. You're not going to read.
Correct. Yes. So you save the original as its source. If needed, you can give them a new diary to go forward, but it has to be stored with the original and shown that, yes, that there has to be a link between the two. But even that one that's all soaked up in coffee needs to be saved and stored because that's the original where all that data is collected. Perfect. Good.
I've had situations where the subject like allegedly
Mm-hmm.
or situation where it feels like you just want to help them explain what they said.
Yes. Yeah.
But we're not supposed to.
Edit their source documents.
So we make a note. What I've done is made a note file. Patient said this is what this said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can. Yeah, if you have a like on your separate source document, you can annotate like that you did clarify with the patient, this is what's written. Yeah. And that's, yes, that's definitely the way you handle that. So number 4, the subject's ECG on the 14th of November resulted as abnormal. The PI reviewed it, he signed it, but what's missing? Correct. He did not label it as not clinically significant or clinically significant. That always needs to be documented on results. So number 5, your subject presents at the visit with a strange looking rash on her back. What could you use for the source to describe the rash? What was that? You could, yes. Yep, and then obviously your own observations as well as the subject's oral report. So once again, that's making sure that you have those text boxes available on your source documentation where the PI can write down what he's seeing, you can write down what you're seeing, you're asking the patient questions and engaging in a conversation with them to get that information.
Number 4, the PI also submitted if you in case of this changes, what else is correct? So they have to get that.
Yep. Okay, we're just going to touch on queries because obviously these are a big part of your ECRF. So like metadata rave, all those kind of things. Obviously, this is where the monitor is putting their queries in. So when data is collected into ECRFs, we will almost always encounter queries. Thorough source documentation makes query answering a breeze. If you have good source documentation, you'll be able to answer these queries really, really easily. But these queries are a communication tool that's used between you and the sponsor, the monitor. It's an ongoing conversation. Queries are persistent, so they don't go away until the data is corrected or the discrepancy is explained. So say your monitor is asking you to correct something that's outside of the parameters. I mean, if what you have entered is the actual value, sometimes they're just looking for a comment in there that explains why. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the data has to be corrected, but even if explaining the discrepancy will satisfy a query. But once again, they're persistent. They don't go away until that's done. Queries prevent major issues at the end of data collection by catching mistakes during the process. I know everyone hates queries, but I swear to God, they're not a negative. Queries are our friends, because otherwise at the end, at the time of data analysis, we'd be catching all the mistakes then. And I mean, that's a couple of years after data collection, you'd be going back trying to figure all of this out. So this is once again, just one of those ongoing processes that you're working with your monitor and your sponsor to make sure that the data is clean and make sure that it's accurate and make sure that it's what they need to meet the endpoints of their study. And then finally, just a reminder, the source data and ECRF must match. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Folks on the line said that the audio was a little low.
Okay, when other people talk?
Yeah.
Okay, I can repeat questions then.
So, thank you. That's very, very good refresher for me. So the source docs are living docs. What do you mean by living docs?
Okay, so her question was, what did I mean by living document when talking about source documents? So yes, source documents are a living document in the sense that they're always changing. It's not one of those documents where we make it, once we start using it, we cannot change it. We refer to ICFs as being living documents too, in the sense that they can be amended. And I mean the same thing with source documentation, that even though you used it on that first patient and you had things looking a little different, it is okay to change it for your next patient to make sure that you're collecting anything you were missing, anything that didn't flow well, things like that. So when I say living document, I just mean that it's changing and it's not permanent in the way you first implement it.
Some IRBs ask for the data collection form to be submitted.
Yep.
So data collection forms are source documents. If we, when the IRB asks me to upload, I always try to get it out.
Yes.
So that way, if that's what they're collecting, because yeah, that can change. So whatever you need to do. So if it's not an investigator study, or even if it was an investigator study.
So the investigator initiated study is a little different because they do create those forms specific for what they're collecting, and that does have to be IRB approved. So an investigator initiated study is a little different because those data collection forms, those do have to be IRB approved. But for like an industry trial, yes, your best bet is going to be to upload your ECRFs, because what the IRB is asking, they're just looking to see what we're collecting, right?
Okay.
And so source documents don't have to be IRB approved. They're not a patient-facing document. There's something that we're using internally. However, yeah, they need to see what data we're collecting. So yeah, your best bet is going to always be to submit those ECRFs. Yep. Under the umbrella of what you're submitting. Yep. Yep.
I have an observation about this. Christian said, in the perfect world, this is what I don't know about everyone else, but sure, I've never lived in a perfect world when it comes to queries. That what I would like to know, I haven't go up for myself, but if there's anyone on the call that has a story they could tell about some strange feelings they've had, how they responded to them. Carolyn has one of the on the line, and she's not going to have Thursday. Carolyn, are you available?
Can't see you. Carolyn, are you on? Yes, she is. She's unmuting.
Okay, okay.
Did you hear what she was asking?
I am on. I did not hear what she was asking. Was it about the query I had?
Yes, she wants you to explain the query that you had.
Oh, yes. It was for a GI study, and the monitor had asked that I document in concomitant medications any bowel preps given for the study's colonoscopies. So in this situation, it was simply a tap water enema. And I got a bounce back on the query asking me for the brand name of the tap water enema and then the active ingredients in the tap water enema. So just a reminder that while data management's important, they may not always be medically minded because, of course, the active ingredients would be water.
Sounds like a computer generated query. Could it have been a computer generated query?
Usually you can see in there if it's computer generated or not.
It
Usually
was
'cause
not an auto
it
generated
wasn't
one.
auto. Okay.
That's
Yeah, I was
the
gonna
thing.
say, you can usually see if it's auto generated. Once again, that audit trail for part 11 compliance, you can see who's putting them in. So you can usually, and that's something that pops up with queries a lot too,
Right.
where you get really silly auto generated
Right.
queries that you can see that the system is pulling. And once again, it's just responding to those, documenting that you've had the conversation. It looks like we have a comment here in the chat too. Joe said that for logs like AEs and ConMeds, it really helps him to also go to the EDC for the study and see what they asked for there and base the log off of that. Yeah, that's awesome. Especially like at startup, if they provide you with the ECRFs, like in a PDF document, when you create your source documentation, going into that and looking, like he said, exactly what they're correct or asking for in the electronic data capture, that's awesome. That's the way to do it. Cause then you'll have it even built out exactly like them, which makes your data entry go way faster as well too, as a coordinator. And then he said he gets those same things with multivitamins and things like that. Those silly queries.
What want me to put for like, not a link? You want me to put it
Yeah.
like whatever I put it.
Just tell me what you want. Yeah.
Kirsten, we cannot hear anyone else in the room. If you could
Okay.
repeat your comments, or it'll help us understand what's being said.
We were told otherwise, so we apologize.
Yeah, sorry. We had a little, technical issues with setup. But no, she was saying that she had a query for anesthesia when she had a child that was anesthetized, that they were asking for the reason for the anesthesia. And that her response was to keep the child asleep, and she wasn't exactly sure what they were looking for. Yeah, after they didn't like her first response, that she just wasn't exactly sure what to put. And so we were saying it would be nice if monitors could just tell us exactly what they want us to put in there. But obviously they can't do that because it has to be based off a source. So
If you are asked to change information on your query, for example, I have put down that it's a poll, the 80 was poll, and it starts back with what were the symptoms of the poll. Let me know if I'm talking. Okay, those are two separate AEs. And so having put all of that down. So if you go back, if you try to change that and make that each one of the AE, you need to go back to the source document.
yes.
And make each one of these, you can make sure that the source, do not change the data, but add it, data, and explain, about the thing.
So Shar was saying that she's had times where she's reported in her AE log that the patient had a cold, and that the monitor then came back and asked what the symptoms of the cold were. You know, she said runny nose, cough, that kind of stuff. That the monitor then asked that those be provided as separate AEs, that the symptoms themselves be the AEs and not just the cold in general. And so she was just saying that it's important to make sure that when you're updating those per the monitors or the sponsor's request in like Brave or your eSource like that, that you're going back and updating your source documents, your original AE log as well to reflect, so that once again, no matter where we look at that data throughout the entire systems, that they match. So just making sure that while responding to queries, you're also going back to update source documents in any way that you need to as well.
And speaking of queries, has anyone ever had the monitor change in the middle of a study? Yes. What seems to happen?
Char's asking about monitor changes throughout a study. If anybody's ever had it where right in the middle of the study, a monitor changes, and then what happens after that monitor changes? How does that impact you?
affect the EDC and the queries? You're gonna get a whole load of
Yes, the answer is you're going to get a ton of queries. They tend to, sometimes they'll even go back and look at data that's already been monitored and new queries pop up. Yeah, that always tends to be when the queries start flowing.
And one of the things that we do put in our budget, we do put a line item in for coordinating.
Yep. Budgeting for monitor changes, coordinator changes, is what Char's talking about now, just making sure that you have that line items and budgeted, because of the increase of work surrounding that.
Or they will redo the EDC database. You have to go back and add information that you didn't have to add before. Sometimes it would be the information that you did not have to fill up. And so you're going back and doing a lot of, re-entry.
Yep.
And so also putting in your budget that if there's a huge change.
Yep, budgeting for EDC changes. Joel said that he's had data rechecked and unlocked and lots of questions because it seems they didn't pass along the documentation that the original monitor had. Yes, that's very common. That's definitely a big one too. And which is why we talked also about making sure that we have that data available, even after it's been in long-term storage and things like that, having that data available so that at any time we can pull it out and have it be rechecked. All of those Alcoa principles are coming in clutch right now, because yes, that's another situation that does come up.
I think to avoid the very, really describe the, for example, if patient has a rash on his leg, her leg, don't just put rash on leg. What leg was, where was the rash, how big was the rash? Put as much information as you can on your source document, because you will be asked about it.
Yep, Shar was mentioning making sure to include as much information as possible on your source documents. So if you have a leg rash, which leg, all that kind of stuff. Because otherwise those are things that come up as queries in the monitoring process.
You also mentioned make sure that all lab tests results are printed out and signed by the investigator. So for labs that go through the lab for the study,
Central labs, yeah, like ones that are sent out.
Come back with, are they now electronic, or we've seen a lot of electronic
Yes.
ones, and then those can be put right into Florence, or how does the workflow go for these electronic?
So when you get your results back electronically for labs,
Yes.
yep, they still need to be printed and signed that he's seen
Oh,
them.
they still need to be printed, so they'll
Right.
go in the hard copy. Right?
Yep.
Well, I mean, can't you print into an electronic copy of that?
And
You
then
can do that too,
investigator
yep.
can sign.
Yep.
Yes,
He still just needs to be able to sign them and show that he reviewed them, and you have to have the
Okay.
documentation of that.
Right now we're at what I consider to be kind of a strange situation where we have some things that are in Florence, some things that aren't, some PIs do use Florence, some PIs don't use Florence, some monitors who don't understand Florence. And so yeah, right now it's still in learning curve as far as I'm concerned.
Yep.
So, and then as far as lab results that are required as a part of screening that are done to standard. Do you need to take copies of those, or can you rely on the monitor going into the medical record?
If you, so she was asking about lab results that for screening, if they're standard of care, do we have to print those out or can we rely on the monitors to go and check those themselves? So on your source documentations, if you don't want to print them out, you do need to have a little section on there documenting where you found it. So you say, lab results, please see this day, this time resulted, you know what I mean? So that you're telling the monitor exactly where to find them in Epic, exactly which labs you pulled those values from. So as long as you have that documented on your source document itself, then you don't necessarily have to print those labs out of Epic, no. But there just has to be that trail documented.
Right, and that is the reason too, you want to make sure that your PI is part of your inclusion exclusion criteria. Because if you're looking at labs, you can, okay, this matches, this matches, this matches. The PI should be looking at that too.
Yep, the PI should always be the one looking at those labs.
This
Yep,
is correct.
yes.
And then signing off on that. He's signing off on their.
Inclusion,
that they meet
exclusion.
all the criteria.
Right. He's signing
Yep,
off.
he's signing off that those included, yep, that everything meets, which is meets the requirements, which is why it's so important to have that signature line on your inclusion exclusion criteria for your screening source to show that we did review this and everything looks good. Yep,
And then on the source document, what I do is I put, for example, we use the red blood count. And then I would put like the value, what the value is.
Yep.
Any other,
Yeah, any
questions
other
or
questions?
suggestions on topics you'd like us to cover?
Shard asked if there's any suggestions for other topics that you guys would like to see covered as well. If anyone wants to enter into the group chat.
You can always reach out to your email too for suggestions.
Yep, yes, and you guys can always email suggestions as well. We are more than willing.
Where do those suggestions go to?
We can, do you want to go to you?
Yes.
Yep, you can reach out to Shar directly for any suggestions for. So it looks like we have,
Called CPSI. Ordinary discussion.
so we have a question in the chat too. It says, Jennifer asks, any suggestions on what communications, so with sponsor, et cetera, to keep and how to best store them? It doesn't seem feasible to print out every little email with the sponsor, as some are mundane and not particularly important. This is a really good question. And I think this is one that a lot of people, I think we all start out the study really good where we're like, oh, print, file, and then things get crazy and you have 100 emails and you're like, do I need these? Yeah, so that's a good question. Any emails where they're making big decisions, anything where we're talking about changes in the study, where they're providing updated documents, all of that kind of stuff is things that should definitely be saved as communications. Any communication with your PI directly, things like that. Obviously not every single email. I mean, you can, at the end of the conversation, it's easy to just print to PDF the whole conversation and store it as one instead of a bunch of little emails, but
Right, you can also create a folder where you're throwing all of
Yep.
those emails in. And then
At the end of
certain
study.
timeframes, whether it's month, 3 months, or next to the study, you can go in and create a PDF of all of those messages. that you
Yep.
have saved electronically and just
that's
add in.
that's what I do. That's the easiest way to do it. So Shard said that you can create an inbox, like a folder in your email and stuff where you're, every time you're getting those communications, you're moving them over. And then at the end, or I do it at the end, but she was saying otherwise you can do it every month, every 3 months, every 6 months, kind of however you want to prioritize it, what you have the time for, saving them even as one big chain and filing them so that you have that documentation. Yeah.
Learn how to save them. When you do it.
Yeah. Coordinator turnover is the hardest part of saving communications. It really is. Yeah.
We also have a line item in the budget for that.
Yeah, there's a line item in the budget for that too. Yeah. That is, it's hard because a lot of the times, even when you're the coordinator taking over a study from somebody else, you're like, darn, do I wish I had all these communications. Even if you're working on the study, yes. Yep, but you weren't getting all of the emails, yes. And yeah, once again, it's one of those places where it's a lot of documentation that would be nice to have, so. Yeah, yeah, and it's nice, obviously, if you're the coordinator passing off too, if you do have that folder where you're putting everything, you can like mass forward, yep, to where they do have all the communications and stuff. So Char's suggestion of keeping little sub boxes with all sponsored communications is a good idea. Okay. Is there any other questions before we log off here? If you guys do have questions afterwards, you're free to reach out via email. My email's in the beginning of the presentation. You can reach out to Char as well if you guys have ideas for meetings going forward that you guys want to learn more about. Also reach out to Char. Otherwise, thank you guys all for attending. We appreciate it. Yeah, I can stay logged in. All right, thank you, everyone.